Grandma, Arthur and I have found a wonderful nursing home for you. They'll take better care of you than we ever could, said my granddaughter, the one I raised after her parents died. I simply smiled in silence and pulled a sealed envelope from the desk drawer. After reading its contents, she sank into a chair and covered her face with her hands. In recent years, my world had been gradually shrinking. First I gave up long trips, then evening walks, and eventually, I stopped visiting old friends. I watched my life fold in on itself like an aging flower. The day Elizabeth and Arthur appeared on my doorstep without warning, I sensed trouble long before I saw their strained smiles. Their visit stirred a memory of another encounter, many years ago. James and Rebecca, newly married, had crossed that same threshold. My daughter's eyes sparkled with joy, and her husband's gaze promised a stable, secure future. James held Rebecca's hand with the care of a collector touching a rare artifact. "Mom, we have news," Rebecca had said, and I already knew she was pregnant. A mother's intuition had whispered it to me, the glowing face, the way she kept touching her belly with the tips of her fingers. None of us could have foreseen that this gentle hand would one day become a vice from which my daughter could never escape. The memory faded. Elizabeth hugged me with a new kind of caution, speaking more softly than usual, the way people speak to the ill. Arthur remained in the background, impeccably dressed, his shirt ironed to a crisp perfection. I had long noticed his habit of stroking his wedding band during moments of discomfort, an unmistakable signal that an unpleasant conversation was coming. From the fleeting glances they exchanged, it was clear they had rehearsed this visit. They had prepared, chosen their words carefully, devised a strategy. As I poured tea into antique cups reserved for special occasions, I felt my hands suddenly disobey. Lately, such moments came more often, brief lapses in coordination, hesitation before the simplest of tasks. Over tea, the conversation meandered over the surface of life, the weather, a new exhibition, Arthur's promotion at the clinic. Elizabeth, usually blunt to the point of rudeness, avoided the real reason for their visit. Finally, when the last drops of tea cooled in our cups, she exhaled and said what they had come to say, a proposal for a nursing home where I would be better cared for than by them. Time froze. In the room's silence, the clock ticked with absurd solemnity. Dust swirled in a beam of sunlight, like slow falling snow. At the mention of a nurse named Martha, supposedly someone I knew in my youth, a bitter taste of disappointment rose in my mouth. There had never been any Martha. They hadn't even bothered to study my life properly before this conversation. My gaze fell on Elizabeth's wrist. A delicate silver bracelet with two halves of a heart, a gift from Arthur for their 5th anniversary. A charming accessory, concealing a state-of-the-art GPS tracker. History was repeating itself with terrifying precision. My memory dragged me 15 years into the past, to a sunny April day. Rebecca beamed as she showed off her new jewelry. "See, Mom? James gave it to me. He says that even when we're apart, our hearts will always be connected." I had genuinely admired the romantic gesture. Only later, overhearing a conversation, did I understand the bracelet's real purpose. "Why didn't you answer your phone? Where were you?" James's voice was deceptively soft, but with metallic undertones that chilled my fingertips. "I went grocery shopping. The phone died," Rebecca answered. "Then why did the bracelet show you were at a cafe on Oak Street? Were you meeting someone?" Their voices carried from the kitchen while I sat in the living room, frozen with a book in my lap, too afraid to move. "It was just a chance meeting with a colleague. We had coffee." My daughter's voice trembled with panic. "You should have called." I was worried. You know what happens to me when I worry. Back in the present, I noticed Arthur glancing at his phone now and then, surely tracking Elizabeth's location in real time. I said nothing in response to their proposal. I simply smiled and stood from the table. The secretary in the corner of the living room held the family's history across generations. My hand, now marked with age spots and prominent veins, touched the polished wood that once felt the fingers of my mother, and before her, my grandmother. Here, our secrets were kept. Some harmless, others capable of shattering lives. In the third drawer lay an envelope I had sealed 25 years ago, the night after Rebecca and James's funeral. The paper had yellowed with time, but the truth within was still as sharp as the day I wrote it. When I handed the envelope to Elizabeth and called her by her childhood nickname, Lizzie, she flinched. Her fingers touched the envelope like a bomb technician defusing a mine. Arthur tensed, straightened, ready to intervene. In that moment, his resemblance to James was so vivid it took my breath away. I watched Elizabeth's face shift as she read. First mild confusion, then disorientation, then the slow cracking of understanding. And finally, collapse. The defensive structure she had built around the image of her parents crumbled, burying her sense of self in the rubble. When she reached the final page, her hands dropped limply. She covered her face with her palms, a gesture that reminded me of her at age 4, when she tried to hide from the world simply by closing her eyes. Denial burst forth in fury. Elizabeth refused to accept the truth about her father's mental illness, that the crash had been caused by a manic episode, or that she was adopted. Her eyes, so like Rebecca's in their expressiveness, flashed with rage. "This is a lie. All of it," she shouted, hurling the papers toward Arthur and storming out of the house. The slam of the front door echoed through the suddenly still home. In the silence that followed, Arthur examined the documents. A doctor by training, he quickly sifted through the medical records, analyzing symptoms, cross-checking dates. "Bipolar disorder," he murmured, scanning the diagnosis. "Severe manic episode with psychotic features. Lithium therapy prescribed. Patient non-compliant." I let him read without interruption. Then, instead of discussing the obvious, I asked the question that had haunted me ever since I noticed the bracelet. "Arthur, that GPS tracking bracelet you gave Elizabeth. Why?" His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in defense. "How did you? I've been watching you for 4 years. I see how you check your phone every few minutes. How tense you get when she's late. How you call her with flimsy excuses, just to find out where she is." He turned pale, then his face flushed deep red. He was forming defensive arguments, but something in my gaze stopped him. He looked down. "Elizabeth is unwell," he said quietly. "You've seen how she reacts to stress. Sometimes she has episodes. We've been treating depression for years, but she hides it. Especially from you." He paused and then, as if gathering courage, went on. "This nursing home. The truth is, we were planning to sell your house to pay for a treatment program at a private clinic. In the last few months, she stopped taking her antidepressants. She says they change who she is, make her feel not herself. I'm afraid. Afraid she might hurt herself." His words hung heavy in the air. In that moment, I realized that both he and Elizabeth had been living all these years under the shadow of James, a ghost they never even knew existed. Evening darkened the corners of the room. Elizabeth didn't return. Arthur stayed in the guest room. His phone glowed through the night, sending messages that remained unanswered. In the morning, a brief reply came. "I'm at Carol's. I need time." In the pre-dawn stillness of the kitchen, as Arthur and I shared an uneasy wakefulness, I saw a different side of him. Behind the need to control every step his wife took was a genuine fear of losing her, not out of possessiveness, but out of deep love and concern. "Elizabeth has this whole self-check ritual," he said, staring at his hands. "Every morning, she checks her pulse. She says if her heart rate is over 90, it might signal the start of a manic episode. Then she looks at her pupils. Are they dilated? Is she acting too energized? When we argue or even when she gets excited about something, she'll suddenly stop and ask, 'Am I okay right now? Am I being too emotional?' Exhaustion from a sleepless night and emotional turmoil had left him vulnerable." He looked up at me, eyes filled with pain. "One night, she cried for hours while watching our dog. She said she read about people in psychosis harming their pets. She had a dream that he faltered, that she did something terrible. Even though she has never, ever shown violent tendencies. She's not afraid of who she is, she's afraid of who she might become because of an illness she might not even have." I wrapped my hands tightly around the cup of cold tea. My smart, strong Lizzie had been living in a private hell for years, one I might have spared her if only I'd had the courage to tell the truth sooner. Arthur suddenly fell silent mid-sentence, as if realizing just how much he had shared with someone he had always seen as a pleasant but distant relative. Sunday dinners, polite weather conversations, small Christmas gifts. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" he asked after a long pause. "About James's illness? About Elizabeth being adopted?" A hard question. My fingers, once nimble and strong, now bore age spots and swollen joints. These hands had soothed little Elizabeth when she woke from nightmares, over and over again losing her parents in her dreams. She was only 4 when they died, I said slowly, weighing every word. Far too young for such a heavy truth. Then came the time when she idolized her father, building in her mind the image of a flawless hero. Especially in adolescence, when children so desperately need role models. James always looked attractive, strong, and confident in photographs. For a girl growing up without a father, the imagined ideal felt psychologically necessary. Arthur nodded in understanding. We all build protective structures out of half-truths and fantasies. Then she began showing signs of her own fear of mental illness, I continued. At first it was subtle, heightened anxiety, and interest in books about psychiatric disorders. I dismissed it as a phase, part of her sensitive nature. Then she met you. And you saw the resemblance to James, he finished for me. Not in a clinical sense, I clarified. In behavioral patterns. The same type of attention, intense, all-consuming. The same care, teetering on the edge of control. The same fear of loss. He remained still, but I could see my words had reached him. Deep inside, the process of realization had begun, one no defense mechanism could stop. That day, I opened the old safe hidden behind the ancestral portrait of my grandmother. Arthur and I reviewed the documents I had collected and guarded all these years. Medical reports on James's condition, including confidential genetic tests he had taken shortly before his death, when Elizabeth was about 3. He wanted to know if he had passed on a predisposition to bipolar disorder to the girl he believed was his daughter. But Elizabeth was adopted, Arthur murmured, flipping through the pages. Why test a child who wasn't biologically his? By then, his illness had progressed, I said quietly. During his manic or psychotic episodes, he often forgot about the adoption, or outright denied it. Rebecca's journals contain entries about how he insisted Lizzie was their biological child and that the adoption papers were forgeries created by enemies who wanted to destroy their family. In those moments, he imagined a striking resemblance between himself and Elizabeth, a resemblance that didn't exist. Paradoxically, his paranoid idea that Lizzie wasn't his daughter was actually true, but he believed the opposite. The tests showed no specific markers associated with elevated risk. More importantly, they confirmed that Elizabeth was not biologically related to James, although he never accepted that conclusion, blinded by his paranoia. I told Arthur the story of the adoption. How their first child had died shortly after birth due to a congenital heart defect. How Rebecca had sunk into a deep depression, refusing food, unable to sleep, speaking of the pointlessness of life. And how James, during one of those bursts of manic clarity and energy, had decided to fix everything. His brother Thomas was a lawyer, specializing in family law and adoptions. Through his channels, he learned about a young dancer, a conservatory student, who had decided to give up her child for the sake of her career. Using his contacts in the medical field and bribing the necessary officials, James arranged an expedited, semi-legal adoption. On paper, everything looked legitimate, but many mandatory procedures had been bypassed. I showed Arthur photographs from that time. Rebecca with newborn Elizabeth, me beside them, all 3 faces glowing with cautious hope. These pictures held silent testimony to the beginning of a new life built on a fragile foundation. The day I first saw Elizabeth remains etched in my memory with remarkable clarity. Rebecca was sitting by the window, the rays of the setting sun playing in her light hair, giving it a copper sheen. In her arms, she held a bundle wrapped in a soft yellow blanket. "Mom," she whispered as I entered, "meet our daughter." I stepped closer, expecting to see a variation of James and Rebecca's first child, a girl with a sprinkle of red freckles and a pointed chin, so much like her father it had always been a little unsettling. But the face of my new granddaughter was entirely different, soft features, chubby cheeks, and an unbelievably aware gaze for a newborn. I reached out my finger, and her tiny hand grasped it with unexpected strength. "She's ours," Rebecca said with a tone that allowed no argument. "Completely ours." In that moment, I accepted the unspoken pact, never to mention that my daughter had not been pregnant, that this child didn't carry their genes. It was easier that way, for Rebecca, devastated by grief, for James, whose illness was progressing, and for the baby herself, who would grow up in a family held together by fragile threads of love, fear, and secrets. A spring morning filled the living room with soft light filtering through lace curtains. In that gentle brightness, Arthur and I, two people not related by blood but united in our love for Elizabeth, began to build a new understanding of one another. The days passed slowly. I returned to my usual routines, trying to maintain a familiar rhythm: gardening, reading, short walks around the block. Arthur visited daily, sometimes staying the night, as if hoping Elizabeth might reappear at any moment. One day, he found me in a strange state. I was standing in the middle of the living room, holding a sweater Elizabeth had left months ago, and I couldn't remember why I'd picked it up or where I was going. "Are you all right?" he asked, approaching carefully. I blinked a few times, returning to the present. These disorientation episodes had become more frequent lately, fleeting lapses when the world blurred, and clear thought slipped away like a fish through my fingers. "Just got lost in thought," I said, folding the sweater neatly. Arthur didn't dwell on the incident. He was immersed in his own transformation, attending therapy sessions focused on managing controlling behavior, trying to uncover the roots of his fear of loss. At my last session, the therapist asked me to recall the earliest times I felt the need to control everything, he said, slicing vegetables for dinner. Cooking calmed him, it gave him the illusion of order in a chaotic life. I remembered how, at 10, I used to make shopping lists for my mother and insisted she stick to them exactly. How I checked the doors and windows every night, 3 times. His hands, swift and sure with the knife, paused for a second. It all started after my father hit my mother for the first time. I couldn't protect her, but I could control the small things. Built a system where everything was predictable. I wanted to respond, but suddenly realized I'd forgotten what we were talking about. A vague anxiety washed over me. These memory gaps were becoming more serious. On the 3rd day, Elizabeth returned, drawn, with dark circles under her eyes, as though she hadn't slept at all. But there was a new resolve in her gaze, replacing the previous confusion. She didn't start with greetings. Upon entering the house, she simply said, "I hired a private investigator. He's verifying everything you told me." There was pain in her cold detachment. She didn't apologize for disappearing, didn't want explanations. The only thing she asked for was Rebecca's diaries, which I had mentioned in my letter. I led her to the study, now something of a memory sanctuary. In the old secretary desk were 7 leather-bound notebooks, the yearly diaries Rebecca had kept from the time she met James until her death. As I handed them to Elizabeth, I warned, "What you're about to read may change how you see your parents forever. Are you sure you're ready?" She nodded with the expression of an adult, firm and deliberate, so unlike her usual impulsiveness. Taking the diaries, she locked herself in the study. The hours stretched into eternity. Day faded into twilight, then into night. Arthur paced the house like a caged tiger, stopping again and again at the door to the study, listening to the silence beyond. I noticed he didn't check his phone once, though it lay on the table. A small, but meaningful sign of change. Sitting in the living room, I mentally turned the pages of those diaries I knew almost by heart. Especially the last entry, dated 1 day before the accident. Sometimes I feel like the only way to be free is to disappear. To vanish into thin air. But how can I leave Lizzie? He's never hurt her, but I'm afraid that on one of his bad days, his irritation will cross a line. I have to do something, while I still can. The study door opened just before dawn. Elizabeth emerged with swollen eyes, but her gaze now held something more than just pain, it held understanding. Her phone rang almost immediately, as if synchronized with her appearance. The detective confirmed my account, James's suicide note, kept by his brother, and medical records with his diagnosis. James really was sick, Elizabeth said slowly once the call ended. And my parents. My mother. Why didn't she leave him? That question carried all the anguish of a woman trying to comprehend the choices of another woman trapped in fear. Sometimes love blinds us, I answered carefully. James wasn't always like that. When they met, he was a brilliant young doctor, intelligent, eloquent, full of energy. What was later diagnosed as hypomania first appeared as charisma and enthusiasm. The illness developed gradually. First came the bursts of energy and sleepless nights, then the unprovoked irritability, and finally the plunges into deep depression. I remember the first troubling signs, a Sunday lunch at our house, when James stared at Rebecca not with affection, but with suspicion. When she helped me in the kitchen, he called every 10 minutes, even though he was in the next room. "Just wanted to make sure everything's okay," he said with an unnatural smile. When a neighbor dropped by to borrow a gardening tool and gave Rebecca a friendly hug, James's face contorted with rage, only for a moment, but enough to notice. After they left, I called my daughter, cautiously asking if everything was all right. "James is just tired," she said. "Tough patient, he's barely sleeping." I believed her. Or chose to believe. No one wants to see a monster in the man their beloved child has chosen. Elizabeth listened, shadows of understanding flickering across her face. Then her gaze settled on Arthur, and something invisible passed between them. Without a word, they walked out into the garden to speak alone. Through the window pane, I could see their silhouettes, sometimes drawing closer in moments of understanding, sometimes pulling apart when emotions flared. The morning fog wrapped around their figures, giving the scene an almost mystical quality. When they returned, both looked exhausted, but something had shifted between them, a fragile understanding born of pain. They decided to go home, to process everything they had learned. Elizabeth also expressed a desire to find her biological mother. When she said it, her voice trembled. She was afraid it might hurt me, afraid I'd see it as betrayal. To my own surprise, I felt neither jealousy nor fear. On the contrary, it felt right, that she should come to know all the pieces of herself, gather the fragments of her identity into a new, whole reflection. Her farewell hug brought me back to those days when she was a little girl, running to me with her childhood woes, a broken doll, a scraped knee, an argument with a friend. After they left, the house filled with a different kind of silence, not heavy, but expectant. I walked over to the mantel, where Rebecca's photos stood. For the first time in years, I looked at them without the weight of unspoken truths. That new silence was broken unexpectedly. 10 days after Elizabeth left, the doorbell rang, sharply, insistently, loud enough to stir even my old, mostly unreliable hearing. When I opened the door, I saw a man I didn't immediately recognize, Thomas, James's twin brother. Time had changed him beyond recognition. Once, he and James looked so alike even close friends confused them. Now Thomas looked 20 years older than his age, gaunt face, sunken eyes with yellowed whites, skin a sickly gray tone. He smelled of alcohol, but there was something else too, a sweet, chemical scent I couldn't identify. "Where is she?" he asked without greeting. "Where's Elizabeth?" I tried to close the door, but he pushed it open with surprising force. "Your granddaughter hired a detective," he muttered, walking inside. He came to me. Asked about James. About the note. "What did you tell her?" I noticed his fingers clutch something in his jacket pocket. A chill of fear ran down my back, but not for myself. For him. For the man whose eyes now shimmered with the same madness I had once seen in James. "Elizabeth left with her husband," I said as calmly as I could. "Thomas, you need help." He let out a short, barking laugh. "Help? And where was all this help when James was fighting his demons? Where were you all then?" His movements were erratic. He drifted around the room, brushing his hands against objects, photographs, books. His dilated pupils and twitchy behavior revealed not just drunkenness, but the influence of narcotics as well. "You know what James wrote to me before he died?" he asked, pulling a crumpled paper from his pocket, a copy of the note, written in his brother's familiar hand. "Tommy, I can't take it anymore. The voices won't let me rest. Please take care of them." His voice broke. He didn't mean to kill Rebecca. He just wanted to stop the pain. He begged her not to get in the car that day, but she insisted. Said she knew how to calm him down. It was a new piece of the puzzle I hadn't known. Rebecca had gotten into the car willingly. Was she trying to prevent a tragedy? Thomas paced, muttering to himself. Then he stopped in front of a photo of Elizabeth in her graduation dress. "You know she's not their daughter, right?" His eyes sparkled with strange triumph. "Of course you do." Everyone knew. The dirty little secret of the Clark family. I stayed silent, letting him speak. Something told me this confession needed to run its course. "I helped them adopt her," he continued. "James was desperate after their daughter died. Rebecca tried to take her own life, twice. And then one of my clients, a young dancer from the conservatory, got pregnant by her professor. His face twisted into a bitter smirk. Convenient, wasn't it? She wanted to get rid of the baby, keep her career. James wanted a child to bring Rebecca back to life. A perfect trade. I arranged everything. Faked the necessary documents. Bribes to the right people, rigged inspections. Everyone was happy to look the other way. His gaze grew distant, as if he were watching something from long ago. You know what the worst part is? That dancer, she was my lover. I loved her. And the baby, she swore it wasn't mine. Said it was from some married professor. The revelation stunned me. The story was growing more tangled, the connections more complex. James and I had a deal, Thomas went on. I helped him with the adoption, he supported me financially. After he died, the trust fund kept paying me. But 3 months ago, the money stopped. And the voices just keep getting louder. He collapsed to his knees, shoulders shaking. A pocket knife slipped from his jacket, just a simple folding knife, but it wasn't necessary. Thomas was no longer a threat to anyone but himself. I carefully picked up the knife and called the police. By the time the officers arrived, Thomas was asleep on the couch, drained by emotion and drugs. 3 days later, the city hospital called. Thomas had been found in a cheap motel on the outskirts, heroin overdose. Next to him was a suicide note that confirmed his story about Elizabeth's origins, with additional details about how he helped conceal the real cause of the accident by destroying evidence and giving false testimony to investigators. His death added yet another layer of complexity to the story Elizabeth would have to be told. But before I could decide how to share it with her, Arthur called. His voice was tense, worried. Elizabeth had disappeared, she hadn't come home from work, hadn't answered her phone for over a day. He told me about their difficult conversations in recent weeks, how he had confessed to tracking her location through the bracelet, how she had gotten angry but tried to work through it with him. About his therapy sessions, confronting his control issues. The day before she vanished, Elizabeth had received the information about her biological mother from the detective. She had been excited, planning to stop by his office after work to pick up the documents. And never came back. A wave of fear hit me. Images of the crushed car on the mountain road, the twisted metal that killed Rebecca and James, overlapped with Elizabeth's face in my mind. But I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think rationally. What would I do, if I had learned something like that? Where would I go? A memory surfaced, a conversation with 10-year-old Elizabeth. We were working in the garden, transplanting rose bushes, her little hands dirty with soil. "Grandma, where was I born?" she asked suddenly. I froze, afraid to say too much. But I didn't want to lie outright either. "At St. Mary's Hospital," I said, technically not a lie. Elizabeth had indeed been born there. Just not to Rebecca. Was Daddy with Mommy then? Was he holding her hand? Yes, sweetheart. He was there. Her face lit up. I knew it. I often have this strange dream, a white room, Mommy's blonde hair, Daddy's hand holding hers. But that's weird, isn't it? I couldn't possibly remember my birth. Maybe it's from the photographs, I suggested, glad for the change in topic. Your mom had a whole album. Maybe, she nodded, returning to the roses. Where is that hospital? In Riverside. About 2 hours from here. That memory told me where to look. I told Arthur to check orphanages near Riverside, especially the one mentioned in Elizabeth's adoption documents. The agonizing 3 days of waiting stretched into eternity. I went through the motions, cooking meals I couldn't eat, flipping through books without grasping their meaning, staring out the window at passing cars, hoping to spot Arthur's familiar silver sedan. My thoughts kept returning to Thomas's revelations. Could Elizabeth's biological mother have known our family even before the birth? I went through old photo albums, looking for any clue, and stumbled upon a group photo from the opening of the pediatric wing at the hospital where James worked. He stood in the center with other doctors, Rebecca beside him in an elegant light blue dress. And on the other side, a group of young dancers in light costumes. A ballet school performance had been part of the charity program. Flipping the photo over, I saw a note in my daughter's handwriting, "Wing opening. James, me, the dance group from the conservatory, Mary P. Soloist, Professor Anderson, Dr. Manning. The rest of the names had blurred into an illegible line. Mary P. Could she have been the dancer, Elizabeth's biological mother? And who were Professor Anderson and Dr. Manning? Something told me these were important pieces of the puzzle. On the fourth day, Arthur called. They had found Elizabeth. She was sitting on a bench in the hallway of the Sunny Home Orphanage in a small town near Riverside. For hours, she had been watching the children through the glass door of the playroom. Her phone had died on the first day, and she hadn't brought a charger. She slept in her car in the parking lot. She simply couldn't make herself leave the place where, perhaps, her life had begun. When they returned, Elizabeth seemed changed, not just physically drained, but as if she had shed a heavy burden. Over hot tea in my kitchen, she shared the information she had found. Her biological mother, Mary Parker, had indeed been a ballerina and now taught dance to children with special needs in Portland. The detective had found her through conservatory archives and an arts education registry. I flinched when I heard the name and showed Elizabeth the photo from the hospital opening. She stared at the young dancer's face for a long time. Maybe it's her. The detective found an old photo of her, and yes, it does look similar. There was a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes as she spoke about the potential meeting with her biological mother. She reacted with light irony to the information about her biological father, Robert Manning, now a renowned expert in family psychology and attachment trauma. Dr. Manning? I asked, pointing to the man in the photo. No, not him, Elizabeth shook her head. According to Mary, it was Robert Edwards, back then an assistant to Professor Anderson. The name sounded familiar, but the memory slipped away, as it often did these days. Something connected to James, the early years of his marriage with Rebecca. Arthur, who had been keeping a respectful distance, now mentioned a consultation he had arranged with Dr. Reynolds, a specialist in the genetics of mental disorders. I noticed how much his tone had changed with Elizabeth. No pressure, no trying to decide for her. Just information, an offer, and space for her to choose. She agreed to the consultation, and they went to the clinic that same day. I stayed home, tired after the emotional strain. As I dozed off in my chair with a book in my lap, I thought about the strange turns of fate that had brought us to this moment. Dr. Reynolds, a gray-haired geneticist with kind eyes behind thick glasses, carefully examined James's old tests alongside the new ones from Elizabeth. His conclusion confirmed that she lacked the specific genetic markers linked to an elevated risk of bipolar disorder. However, he was honest, there are no absolute guarantees in psychiatric genetics, due to the complex polygenic nature of such conditions and the influence of epigenetic factors. But with high probability, Elizabeth's episodes of anxiety and depression were the result of psychological trauma and conditioned fear, not biological predisposition. Many of her symptoms matched nosophobia, a pathological fear of illness, in which a person constantly monitors themselves for signs and interprets normal reactions as symptoms. When she returned home, Elizabeth sat in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, staring at her own face. For years, she had searched for traces of Rebecca and James, her mother's eyes, her father's chin, their smile, their gestures, their speech. People often pointed out those resemblances, reinforcing the illusion of a genetic link. Now, a stranger's face looked back at her, a woman whose true heritage had yet to be discovered. "Who am I now?" she asked Arthur when he came to check on her. He sat down beside her but didn't hug her, not like he would have before, trying to physically anchor her in a place of safety. "You're still Elizabeth," he said simply. "The same woman who amazes me with her strength and vulnerability. The girl Rebecca raised. The granddaughter your grandmother loves. A person brave enough to face the truth, no matter how painful." There was no anxiety in his eyes, only calm acceptance and admiration. For the first time in a long time, he was seeing her, not through the lens of fear, but clearly. In the next moment, Elizabeth took off the bracelet and placed it on the vanity. Not as a dramatic gesture or a challenge, simply with the quiet confidence of someone making a choice. Arthur nodded, understanding the meaning. That night they talked until dawn, not about the past, but the future. About how to build a relationship based on trust, not control. About the possibility of becoming parents someday, and what kind of parents they wanted to be. About fears that still remained, but no longer ruled them. The meeting with her biological mother took place in mid-December, at a small cafe on neutral ground. I went with Elizabeth to support her. Arthur stayed home, understanding that his presence might complicate an already delicate moment. The day was cold but clear. Fresh snow crunched underfoot, and the low winter sun reflected off the white surfaces, creating an illusion of a crystalline, glowing world. Inside the cafe, we were greeted with warmth and the scent of fresh pastries. Mary Parker was already waiting at a corner table, an elegant woman with perfect posture, unmistakably shaped by her ballet past. As we approached, I noticed how her eyes widened at the sight of Elizabeth. The resemblance was undeniable, the same expressive brows, the same high cheekbones, even the slight tilt of the head when listening. "I recognized you immediately," Mary said, shaking my hand. "You taught at the ballet school when I was a junior student." I searched my memory. A faint image emerged, a thin, serious-eyed girl practicing pas de bourrée at the bar. The ballet school at the conservatory, where I occasionally substituted for the accompanist. A young dancer who suddenly disappeared due to family circumstances. "Yes, I remember now," I nodded. "You showed great promise." Mary told her story without embellishment, but also without hiding the difficult parts. Youth, ambition to become a prima ballerina, an affair with a married man, a pregnancy that could destroy her career. At 19, the choice had seemed obvious: give up the child and continue chasing her dream. Her eyes, so strikingly similar to Elizabeth's, filled with tears as she described the 2 days she had spent with her newborn daughter before signing the adoption papers. How she named her Elizabeth after her own grandmother, not knowing whether the adoptive parents would keep the name. How she lit a candle every year on her birthday and wondered if she was doing well. "I never regretted the decision to give you up," she admitted. "Because I knew I couldn't give you what you deserved. But not a day went by without thinking of you." Mary pulled a worn photograph from her purse, a torn half of an old picture showing 2 young women embracing in front of a theater building. To my surprise, I recognized one of them as Anna, James's sister, who had died a year before Elizabeth came into our family. "Anna and I were close friends at the conservatory," Mary explained. "When I got pregnant, she was the only one who supported me. Offered help, but then she had the accident." I stared at the photo in shock. At home, I had the other half of that picture, showing the rest of their graduating class. Suddenly, connections that had once seemed like coincidences took on new meaning. James hadn't just picked a child to adopt, he had chosen the daughter of his sister's friend, as if trying to hold on to a piece of Anna. As we said goodbye, the snow outside the window was bathed in pink and golden sunset light, painting a scene of almost surreal beauty. We agreed to meet again. Mary invited us to her Christmas ballet performance, featuring her students with special needs. Elizabeth was silent for most of the drive home. The lights of passing cars reflected in her eyes, giving her face a contemplative look. She was reflecting on the strange twists of fate, the chain of chance and inevitability that led to her existence. Every tragedy, every decision, every meeting had been a necessary link in that chain. Sitting beside her in the car, I couldn't help but think about my own role in the story. Keeper of secrets, secrets that could heal, or destroy. Had I been right to hide the truth for so long? Or had I, in trying to protect her, only prolonged the pain? A sudden flash of headlights from an oncoming car blinded me, and for a moment, I felt disoriented. I forgot where we were going and why. Panic surged, but I pushed it down, focusing on the steering wheel beneath my fingers, on Elizabeth's presence beside me, on the melody playing from the radio. These episodes were becoming more frequent. Moments of falling out of reality, when the world lost clarity and cohesion. I knew I needed to see a doctor, to tell Elizabeth, but I kept postponing that uncomfortable conversation. There always seemed to be more urgent matters. Winter slowly gave way to early spring. Life settled into a new rhythm: Elizabeth's regular meetings with Mary, joint therapy sessions with Arthur, family dinners at my home that now brought together not just relatives but a circle of people bound by complicated yet sincere relationships. Arthur continued to change, slowly, with inevitable setbacks, but steadily. His methodical mind aided him in this work. He analyzed the triggers of his controlling behavior, traced them to childhood trauma, and learned new strategies for expressing love and care. "I've realized the root of my fear of losing control," he said one evening while helping me with the dishes. "My father worked hard to maintain the illusion of a perfect family, controlling every detail of our lives. Not out of love, but out of fear that without control, everything would fall apart. It was his way of managing anxiety. And I inherited that pattern, even while trying to fight it. His hands moved confidently as he placed plates back in their spots. At my last therapy session, my therapist said that control is just the illusion of safety. The tighter you clench your fist trying to hold onto sand, the more grains slip through your fingers. He glanced out the window, where Elizabeth was talking on the phone, gesturing freely. Their relationship had transformed, not perfect, but deeper and more authentic, based on mutual respect rather than fear and dependence. My own trials were becoming harder to ignore. Memory lapses could no longer be dismissed. I was forgetting recent conversations, mixing up days of the week, losing my train of thought mid-sentence. There were moments when I didn't recognize a familiar street or couldn't recall the way home from a store I'd visited hundreds of times. A visit to the neurologist confirmed my worst fears: early-stage Alzheimer's dementia. The doctor spoke of the progression of the disease, ways to possibly slow it down, the need to prepare for changes ahead. But all I could hear was the soft ticking of fate's clock, counting down the time until I would stop being myself. Arthur, who accompanied me to the appointment, Elizabeth was at a conference, asked all the right questions, took notes, and discussed treatment options. His professionalism was helpful, but even his composure cracked slightly on the drive home. "Why didn't you tell us earlier?" he asked. "Did you know about your condition when you offered to move into the nursing home?" I looked out at the passing city, streets I had walked all my life, buildings I remembered when they were still single-story, now grown into towers. One day, all these familiar places would become strange, unrecognizable sets. The first symptoms appeared about a year ago, I admitted. Forgotten names, lost keys. Then came moments of total disorientation, when I didn't know where I was or what I was doing. "Why didn't you say anything? Why burden you with that too?" Elizabeth was already fighting her own demons. "You were rebuilding your relationship. The nursing home seemed like a reasonable solution. I'd get the care I needed, and you could live your lives, free from the weight of it." Arthur braked sharply and pulled over to the side of the road. His face showed genuine indignation. "A burden?" he repeated. "Do you really think caring for you is a burden for Elizabeth? After everything you've done for her?" His emotional reaction surprised me. This reserved, often distant man was showing more feeling than I had ever seen. "Arthur, I've seen how this illness destroys not only the person but those who care for them," I said. "It's a slow torture, watching someone you love lose themselves piece by piece, forget you, become someone else. I don't want Elizabeth to go through that." He stared at the road ahead, his hands gripping the wheel. "When my mother had cancer, I was doing my residency in another state," he said quietly. "I visited once a month, called on weekends. Thought it was enough. My father hired a caregiver, but barely showed up. He couldn't handle her illness, the sight of her pain. In her final months, she practically died alone." He turned to me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw tears in his eyes. "I won't let that happen again. Not with you. Not with our family." Something changed between us in that moment. We were no longer just an old woman and her granddaughter's husband. We had become a family, united in a common goal: to not give up without a fight, to preserve dignity in the face of the inevitable. Arthur began to study the latest research in neurodegenerative diseases intensively, gradually shifting the focus of his medical practice. He helped enroll me in a clinical trial for a new drug. It didn't promise miracles, but it could slow the progression of the disease. A comprehensive program, including medication, cognitive exercises, and a specialized diet, helped me maintain mental clarity longer than the initial prognosis had suggested. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was walking her own path of acceptance. Her relationship with Mary continued to grow, not as mother and daughter, it was too late for that, but as two adult women connected not only by genetics but also by deep mutual respect. Regular visits to her therapist helped her untangle the layers of fear and trauma accumulated over the years. There were days of denial, when she returned to idealized memories of her parents. Periods of anger, at me for staying silent, at James for refusing treatment for his illness, at Rebecca for not finding the strength to leave. Moments of bargaining: if I had been their real daughter, maybe things would have turned out differently. There was deep depression, during which Arthur found new reserves of patience and support, never allowing her to retreat into isolation. One day in April, when the first flowers were pushing through the damp earth in my garden, Elizabeth arrived alone, soaked to the bone. The rain was pouring in sheets, and it was clear she had been walking for a long time without an umbrella. "I was at the cemetery," she said, after I made her change into dry clothes and drink hot tea with honey. "I wanted to talk to her. To Mom. To Rebecca." There was no bitterness in her voice, none of the sharpness that used to accompany the mention of her adoptive mother. Something had shifted, healed. "I stood in the rain and told her everything I'd held onto all these years," Elizabeth continued. "My anger at her for not finding the strength to protect herself and me. My resentment that she chose him over our safety." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "And then I suddenly realized that she had been a victim too, not just of his abuse, but of her love, her upbringing, her beliefs about duty. That she loved me so much, she accepted someone else's child as her own, poured everything she had into those 4 years. That her choice to stay wasn't weakness, it was her desperate attempt to protect me, the only way she knew how." Elizabeth looked up at me, her eyes wet not just from the rain. "She was my real mother, wasn't she? Not because she gave birth to me, but because she chose to love me, every single day we had together." "Yes, sweetheart," I said, holding her tightly, feeling that something important was concluding in our shared story. "That's exactly why." In May, when the garden was filled with the scent of lilacs and jasmine, Elizabeth brought me a gift, a thick leather-bound notebook. My heart beat faster as I turned the pages filled with her neat handwriting. These were my memories, the stories I had told her about my life, our family, recorded and preserved in case I began to forget them. "It's not just for you," she said softly, sitting beside me. "It's for our future child." I froze, afraid to hope. But her radiant smile and gentle nod confirmed it. She was pregnant, 12 weeks along. She and Arthur had waited until the end of the first trimester to share the news. If it was a girl, they would name her Rebecca, after the woman who had chosen to love Elizabeth with all her heart, despite the absence of blood ties. If a boy, Robert, after Mary's father, the only one in her family who had supported the young mother during her pregnancy. The original plan for the nursing home had long been forgotten. The house that Arthur and Elizabeth once wanted to sell had become a center of gravity for our growing family. Even Mary now came for Sunday dinners, naturally becoming part of our unconventional, but deeply connected circle. October was surprisingly warm. The sun painted the leaves in golden and copper tones, the air filled with that unique clarity of early autumn. I sat on the bench beneath the old apple tree, watching a beautiful scene unfold before me. Elizabeth, just 3 days home from the hospital, introducing baby Rebecca to the garden. The tiny girl, wrapped in a soft blanket, surely didn't understand a word, but she responded instinctively to her mother's voice, turning her head, quieting, listening. Arthur stood beside them, ready to support them both at any moment. A new softness had appeared in his features, a calm confidence of a man who had found his place in life. Over the past months, my illness had progressed, though more slowly than the doctors had predicted. There were good days, when my mind was clear, memory sharp, words flowed into sentences. And there were bad days, when familiar faces seemed vaguely familiar, when simple tasks became overwhelming, and the world around me turned into a confusing maze. But today was a good day. I remembered names, dates, places. I could trace the story behind every photo on the mantel, describe walks with little Elizabeth, recall conversations between Rebecca and James. On such days, I hurried to live, to absorb every moment, to create memories that might not remain in my mind, but would stay with those I love. Elizabeth sat down beside me, gently supporting her sleeping daughter's head. Sunlight filtered through the apple tree leaves, casting golden flecks around them. In that moment, she shared something she had just discovered. "I think I finally understand what Rebecca must have felt when she held me for the first time. It's impossible to describe. Like meeting someone you've always known, even before they were born." She looked at her daughter with a tenderness full of wonder. "Biological connection doesn't matter. Rebecca is my daughter. Just mine. Just like I was Rebecca's." I looked at them, 3 generations of women in our family, bound not so much by blood as by love, choice, and shared story. The image of Rebecca holding newborn Elizabeth overlapped in my mind with the scene before my eyes, creating the strange sensation of time closing in on itself. "She would be proud of you," I said softly. "Rebecca." We both knew my illness would progress. That more difficult days were ahead, when I would begin to lose myself piece by piece, dissolve into a fog of forgetfulness. Elizabeth asked me to tell her daughter about Rebecca while I could still remember the details. I promised I would, on the good days and the bad, until the words left me completely. "You're staying with us," she said. "No nursing homes, no strangers. Family should be together, especially when it's hard." Arthur joined us, sitting in the grass at our feet. His simple words, "We'll get through this," weren't a light promise, but a quiet truth shaped by the trials we had already overcome together. The shadows lengthened, the air cooled with evening. It was time to return to the house. But at that moment, watching the light dance across the faces of the three people I loved most, I thought, even when names begin to slip away, when dates blur, when familiar places become foreign, the most important part of me will go on living in them. 5 years later, the house is filled with voices, laughter, music. Today, little Rebecca turns 5. Mary, who the girl calls Grandma Mary, is teaching her simple ballet steps in the living room, where the furniture has been pushed aside. Elizabeth is preparing a festive dinner, occasionally peeking out of the kitchen to admire her daughter. Arthur, just back from a neurodegenerative diseases conference, is decorating the garden with lanterns and garlands for the evening party. I sit in my favorite chair by the window, watching this life unfold around me, even when I slip out of it. Sometimes I forget the names of the guests, sometimes I mistake my granddaughter for my daughter, sometimes I get lost in my own home. But there are things I always remember, even on the hardest days: the scent of Rebecca's hair, the laughter of little Elizabeth, the taste of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. Today, Becca gave me a drawing, 3 women holding hands. "That's you, Mama, and Grandma Rebecca," she explained seriously. "Mama said you'll always be with me, even when you go to the sky." In her child's mind, death and forgetting aren't endings, but another form of existence, just as real as life. And maybe she's right. Maybe, even when my memories finally crumble like a sandcastle under the tide, something will remain, not in my fading mind, but in the stories they will tell each other, in the gestures that live on in the next generation, in the values they carry through their lives. Isn't that what true immortality is? Not the endless life of body or mind, but the continuation of a part of ourselves in others, in their memory, their blood, their souls. I watch as Elizabeth teaches her daughter to bake cookies using my recipe. Her hands move just like Rebecca's once did when she taught her. Traditions pass from generation to generation without asking permission from genetics. And I realize, memory isn't just what we hold in our heads. It's what lives in our hands, in our hearts, in the people we love. Even when personal memory fades, the collective memory of family, of lineage, of humanity endures. That, I think, is the true price, and the gift, of memory, the willingness to let go of our own stories, trusting that they will live on in others. Not as perfect copies, but as echoes, seeds that will bloom into something new and beautiful. Today is a good day. I remember everything. And even if tomorrow is a bad day, when I forget the names of those dearest to me and my reflection becomes the face of a stranger, something inside me will still remember this feeling, being part of something greater than myself. A link in a chain that will not be broken, as long as love and memory live on.
If you enjoyed the video, please support it with a like and a comment.